Icecrown Citadel. This massive castle is home to potentially the most iconic villain in Warcraft. It is the culmination of numerous storylines and can be considered a climax in the lore. Many of these storylines deserve their own video, and I will provide necessary context, but the focus of this video will be the events on Azeroth that influenced the raid of Icecrown Citadel. This story starts slightly before the Alliance of Lordaeron was created. The Dark Portal. Orcs are a race native to a planet colloquially known as Draenor. There, they lived for hunts and battle, but also possessed a proud connection to nature and honor. However, at the time of the Dark Portal's creation, the Orcs of Draenor were under the dark influences of demon blood, which made them bloodthirsty and war-crazed. Furthermore, the elemental spirits of Draenor had abandoned the Orcs after their spiritual leader, Ner'zhul, had begun inadvertently convening with demons. Without the elements, Draenor was dying, and the Orcs desperately needed to find a planet where they could survive. On Azeroth, the magical guardian Medivh was searching for a way to destroy the demons that plagued him once and for all. He needed a suitable army. Medivh telepathically came across Gul'dan, Ner'zhul's conniving apprentice. Together they could solve their issues by giving the Orcs a new home and giving Medivh an army to defeat the demons. Through the magic and machinations of the human archwizard Medivh and Orcish warlock Gul'dan, a portal was created that joined together the two planets, Azeroth and Draenor. The Orcish horde invaded Azeroth and started a conflict known as the First War. The First War concluded with the fall of the Kingdom of Stormwind. Survivors and refugees fled north to the Kingdom of Lordaeron. Among these refugees were the young Prince of Stormwind, Varian Wrynn, and Lord Anduin Lothar. They carried a horrific message of the Orcish threat that was posed to all kingdoms. The Alliance and the Second War. The King of Lordaeron, Taranis Menethil II, called a meeting of all the leaders in the 7 Eastern Kingdoms. They were Taranis Menethil II of Lordaeron, young Varian Wrynn, represented by Anduin Lothar of Stormwind, Dalen Proudmoore of Kael'Thas, Genn Greymane of Gilneas, Aiden Perinold of Alterac, Thoros Trollbane of Stormguard, and Archmage Antonidas of Dalaran. Furthermore, there was the spiritual leader, Alonzus Fowl, Archbishop of the Church of the Holy Light. At the meeting, it was agreed that the kingdoms would unite and stand against the Orcish horde. The Alliance of Lordaeron gathered other supporters as the Second War raged. High Elves of Kael'Thas, Bronzebeard Dwarves of Ironforge alongside the Gnomergan Gnomes, and the Wildhammer Dwarves, all joined the Alliance. Both sides of the war gained new types of combatants. Gul'dan and his Orcish warlocks experimented with the corpses of their slain foes and managed to place the souls of dead Orcs into the bodies of dead humans. They called these unnatural creatures Death Knights, the first of which being the former warlock Teron Gorefiend. On the Alliance side were soldiers trained in both the magical light-wielding techniques of the Church as well as traditional arms-based combat. These were called Paladins, Knights of the Silver Hand. The first 5 were Uther Lightbringer, Saidan Dathrohan, Tyrion Fordring, Turalyon, and Gavinrad the Dire. With them, the Second War continued and eventually concluded. Orcish leader Orgrim Doomhammer slayed the Alliance commander Anduin Lothar at Blackrock Mountain. He was then defeated and captured by the paladin Turalyon. The Orcish horde was then defeated and scattered. Many returned to the dying Draenor to seek Ner'zhul's advice. Gul'dan died while searching the Tomb of Sargeras, a demonic site in Azeroth. Sheltered from this war and violence was the young prince of Lordaeron, Arthas Menethil. Arthas Menethil's childhood. Only son to King Taranis Menethil II, Arthas would one day rule Lordaeron. His mother was Queen Leanne, and his sister was named Kalia. On the morning that Lothar and Varian arrived in Lordaeron, Arthas watched a young horse be born. The mother horse was named Brightmane, and Arthas chose to name the young foal Invincible. Arthas snuck into the meeting that determined the Alliance of Lordaeron. He had feelings of sorrow about the fate of Stormwind's citizens, but he thought it would be nice to live among another prince in Varian. Arthas assumed that the Second War would be a reason for him to begin training in arms, but the opposite happened. All potential teachers were sent to battle, leaving him without proper instruction. When he sparred with Varian, Arthas would handily lose. Varian was older, and had begun training much earlier. News of the war's conclusion arrived at Lordaeron alongside the captured Orgrim Doomhammer. Though every human around him spat hate at the orc, Arthas swore nothing bad would happen to him while in their care. Orgrim was to be held in the Undercity, a system of prisons and tombs beneath the city of Lordaeron. However, Orgrim would escape, breaking the neck of every human who crossed his path, be they soldier, prisoner, or the wandering homeless person seeking shelter. Orgrim was eventually captured again and sent to an orcish internment camp alongside other captured orcs from the Second War. Most military ongoings were kept from the young Prince Arthas. Not intentionally, but there were more pressing matters for the people of Lordaeron. This didn't assuage Arthas' curiosity though. He would pretend to battle orcs with a wooden sword. He was seen awkwardly dropping his sword by the dwarf ambassador Muradin Bronzebeard, brother to the Ironforge king Magni Bronzebeard. In this moment, Muradin ignored the young prince's ineptitude. Arthas recovered from this embarrassment by going for a ride on his horse Trueheart, while a 2-year-old Invincible followed with a training lead. Arthas wanted to ride Invincible, but he was informed that 2 years was too young for the horse to bear a rider's weight. Arthas ignored the warning and impulsively mounted the horse. Invincible took off into a gallop and bucked the young prince off the saddle. Arthas got the wind knocked out of him while Invincible galloped off into the distance, only to return to the stables later on its own. Uther the Lightbringer harshly reprimanded Arthas for his impulsive decision. That night, Arthas attended the Church of Light's service where he was awestruck by a girl his age, a young Jaina Proudmoore. After the service, Muradin called to him to address his poor fighting form. The Bronzebeard warrior offered to teach Arthas how to fight. Arthas agreed. As Arthas began his combat training, it became evident that his training in other areas needed to be stepped up as well. History, politics, mathematics, calligraphy, riding, hiking, and prayer in the chapel with Uther. He very quickly became too busy to do whatever he wanted. That is to say, he was suddenly too busy to even speak to Jaina, who had become fast friends with his sister Kalia. Arthas eventually offered to escort Jaina to Dalaran, where she was to continue her magical studies. Uther and his father agreed. One night during their trip, Arthas and Jaina snuck out to take a look at a nearby orcish internment camp. Jaina was hesitant since an orc had killed her brother Derek during the Second War, but Arthas convinced her. When they got there, they witnessed a family of orcs in the internment camp who didn't seem to be a large threat. They then returned to their sleeping quarters and continued the trip to Dalaran. After escorting Jaina to Dalaran and parting on friendly terms, Arthas returned to training with Muradin. Years later, he was able to defeat Muradin in sparring for the first time. After this, Arthas found his father insisting that Kalia marry Davor Prester against her will. Prester was Deathwing in disguise, attempting to influence the humans to his ends. Kalia made Arthas promise that once he was king, he would never force his children to marry against their will. That night, Arthas took Invincible out for a ride. Arthas Menethil's adolescence. Aeolus Blackmore was the despicable leader of Durnhold Keep and the son of a traitor. Durnhold ran a gladiator arena with the funds generated off internment camp labor. Blackmore gave Arthas a tour of his operation. He hosted a feast for the prince, where Blackmore inappropriately touched the serving girl. After a meal, he showed off the gladiator fights, where beasts fought to the death. Following the animals, Arthas was shown the undefeated orc gladiator, Thrall, who easily defeated a massive bear and then 3 human gladiators. Arthas noted that it would be trouble if Thrall were to escape from Durnhold. After all, Orgrim was able to escape from the Undercity. After the gladiator show, Blackmore sent his serving girl to Arthas' quarters to sexually tempt the prince. Arthas refused the offer, but allowed her to stay to protect her from any further abuse by Blackmore's hand. At age 19, Arthas was now sparring with Uther in preparation for becoming a paladin. One cold, snowy day, Uther was on a mission assisting the king, leaving Arthas to his own devices. He took Invincible out for a ride, to show its breeders how strong the colt had become. As he rode, he instructed Invincible to jump a trench, but the horse's front legs shattered upon landing, sending both the horse and the rider hurtling toward the stony ground. Arthas came to moments later, to the pained shrieks of his horse. He likely had a head injury and broken ribs, but he managed to crawl his way toward Invincible. He almost lost consciousness again after witnessing his dying steed struggling in a slushy puddle of snow and blood. Arthas screamed out for help, crying before realizing there wasn't enough time. Invincible would be dead long before anyone heard through the frosty night. Arthas did what he had to do to put his beloved steed out of its misery. Arthas knew that this avoidable death was his fault. The young man lifted his sword and pierced Invincible's heart. He was found hours later, curled up next to the dead horse. Arthas claimed the tragedy was an unavoidable accident, but it never would have occurred had he not instructed the horse to leap. That night, Arthas swore he'd make any sacrifice for the well-being of others. A few months later, Arthas rode to his induction ceremony on a horse that wasn't invincible. This put him in a foul mood, despite being a special occasion in the reconstructed Stormwind. On this day, Uther told Arthas that none are worthy of the Light's blessing, but the Light loved them regardless, for the great things people can rise to achieve in the times that they are needed. All of Arthas' friends and family were in attendance alongside the various nobles and clergymen. They were present to witness the Prince of Lordaeron be inducted to the Knights of the Silver Hand and become a full-fledged paladin. Jaina was now the apprentice to Archmaid Antonidas, leader of the Kirin Tor of Dalaran. During her studies, she met Kael'Thas, Prince of the High Elves of Kael'Thas. He was a talented and powerful mage himself, who took a liking to Jaina. However, Jaina found him stiff, formal, and intimidating, despite his attempts to ease her concerns. Arthas visited Jaina during her studies in Dalaran. He claimed that he wished to extend his knowledge of magical histories, but in reality, he wanted to spend time with her. The Lordaeron prince was easygoing when compared to his elven counterpart. One day, Arthas and Jaina shared a horseback ride and had a picnic that later evolved into a playful snowball fight. They then shared an embrace and kissed. Their relationship evolved during their shared time in Dalaran. However, they chose to keep relative privacy about the relationship, so as not to stir the rumor mill about the Lordaeron prince and the Kael'Thas princess. Nonetheless, Kael'Thas stumbled across the pair as they sneakily embraced. Kael'Thas was furious at the display, enough so that Arthas feared the mage would destroy him on the spot. Kael'Thas harshly reprimanded the pair, but said he would share nothing about their coupling. Over time, Prince Arthas grew in favor with both his citizens and those of other kingdoms. He and Jaina celebrated various holidays together, often being cheered for by the townsfolk. The pair fully fell in love with each other. However, prior to the winter ball, their deepening relationship made Arthas recall his promise to his sister. This in turn made him feel uneasy. He was both happy and concerned at the prospects of his future. Marriage, children, ruling a kingdom. He told Jaina that he wasn't ready for their future together, so the couple broke up, even though they loved each other. Arthas lamented the fact that bad things always seemed to occur to him in the winter. Later, Blackmore informed Arthas and King Tyrannus that his champion orc gladiator, Thrall, had escaped Durnhold. The Lordaeron king reprimanded Blackmore for his series of mistakes. Arthas was more focused on finding a way to chase Jaina from his thoughts. He had been training excessively hard with Uther just to exhaust himself past the point of being able to think about her. Now, in seeing the results of his training, the king allowed for him to search for the escaped orc. In Dalaran, Jaina had also heard of this thrall who had been freeing other imprisoned orcs and calling himself the war chief of the new horde. Also, she had heard rumors about a deadly plague developing in the northern lands. Perhaps not entirely a coincidence, the mage had also recently started looking into the expulsion of the Kirin Tor wizard Kael'Thas for delving into necromancy. The wizard's whereabouts were unknown, and this was concerning. In truth, the wizard had disappeared to Northrend in search for the answers to the necromantic mysteries that he researched. The next set of events coincide with the Warcraft 3 campaigns. Discovery of the Scourge. King Tyrannus Menethil dispatched paladins Uther and Arthas to deal with an orc encampment and defend a nearby village called Strawnbrad. This orcish encampment had performed some human sacrifices to demons. Arthas eagerly hunted the orcish leader to enact retribution, but Uther reminded him that vengeance is not the motivation of a paladin. Regardless, they were able to slay the Blade Master leader, but they maintained caution about the demonic sacrifices. Jaina, now a special agent of Dalaran, responded to the plague rumors in the lands to their north and chose to investigate. She reunited with Arthas for the first time since their breakup. Working through some awkwardness, they explored the Northlands and discovered a number of eerily silent farms and villages. As they entered a building, their senses were assaulted with the smell of rotting corpses. Then the corpses rose and attacked the group with unholy ferocity. This was the result of the plague. The undead scourge that killed its victims then reanimated their dead bodies and tormented spirits to be used to kill and spread the disease further. Now the effects of the undead plague were known, but its cause remained a mystery. There had been reports of individual cases of necromancy, such as the Death Knights from the Second War, but this plague was reported to be widespread, making it different and much more terrifying. Arthas and Jaina continued searching for answers while fighting off the turned civilians. They came across a grain silo, infecting the land around it. The grain crates bore the seal of Anderhall, which could potentially be the source of the widespread infection. Later, they discovered a group of cultists wearing black. These were members of the Cult of the Damned, followers of Kael'Thas, working to spread more infected grain throughout the vicinity. The cultists brought forth an abomination, a giant amalgamation of corpses stitched together from different bodies and brought to life with fell magic. Arthas and Jaina dispatched the abomination, but many of the cultists escaped. They tracked the cultists to Anderhall. The town was burning when they arrived. Kael'Thas himself revealed that he and the Cult of the Damned were indeed behind the distribution of the plagued grain. He further revealed that there are others behind the Scourge operation. Namely, the Dreadlord Mal'Ganis was behind the plague creation, aiming to cleanse the Azeroth of the living, weakening it for a future demon invasion. Kael'Thas then informed Arthas that Mal'Ganis was operating out of Stratholme. Jaina and Arthas slay Kael'Thas and make their way to Stratholme to confront Mal'Ganis. They pass through the village of Hearthglen. On their way, Jaina expressed her concern about the way these events had been affecting Arthas. Understandably, he was enraged, desperate to save his townsfolk. But he was also growing hateful and obsessed with obtaining his vengeance, a quality that his mentor Uther warned him to be wary of. Arthas defended his position, and the army continued on their way. Hearthglen had been under attack by undead warriors, and they had already distributed the infected grain among the townspeople. This instantly created an undead force that the heroes were not prepared to face. Arthas stayed in Hearthglen to defend the village, while Jaina teleported away, separating in order to find and bring Uther for assistance. Arthas fended off liches and undead while awaiting Jaina's return with Uther. Witnessing the death and unholy resurrection of his citizens understandably infuriated the prince. He fixated on the apparent leader of the Scourge, Mal'Ganis at Stratholme. On his way to Stratholme, the prophet Medivh contacted Arthas and suggested that he gather his citizens and flee to Kalimdor. Arthas refused that course of action and continued to Stratholme. Jaina witnessed their discussion and tried to convince Arthas to consider accepting Medivh's plan. Again, Arthas refused, pridefully stating that his place is in Lordaeron defending his people. Upon arrival in Stratholme, Arthas found that they were too late. The townsfolk were already infected by the Scourge grain. He decided that their only recourse was to purge the city by killing all the citizens in Stratholme. Jaina and Uther both counsel against this impulsive decision, suggesting that there may be another way. Jaina recalled her studies that stated all things magical in origin can be combated with magic in turn, but Arthas wouldn't hear it. He truly believed it was the only way. The prince then found Uther's refusal to slaughter his own citizens as an act of treason against the crown. Arthas relieved the elder paladin of his command. Uther informed the prince that in this moment he had crossed a terrible threshold. Uther, Jaina, and their soldiers left, disgusted with their prince's actions. Arthas and his followers entered the infected city. The Culling. Arthas was hurt and abandoned by the two he trusted most in the world. He steeled himself, taking solace in the loyalty of the soldiers who still agreed to follow him into the city. The first civilian Arthas killed was a boy, barely out of puberty. The prince's heart ached as he committed the act, cursing Mal'Ganis for making him do it. Arthas looked at his hammer after having caved in the boy's chest, and he saw that it lacked the glow of the light. Arthas looked away from his hammer and turned his attention to the boy's mother. It never got easier for the prince, but Arthas refused to stop. His soldiers too ached, but they reluctantly followed their commander's lead in their misguided mercy. The citizens looked upon the prince and his soldiers with confusion at first, then with panic and terror. Initially, they hadn't felt the need to defend themselves from their own military, but once they realized the threat, the people of Stratholme gathered weapons and formed a small militia. Arthas viewed this as something of a relief. The citizens still didn't stand a chance, but at the very least he wasn't slaughtering unarmed civilians. During the culling, Arthas was taunted by Mal'Ganis, who began personally turning the citizens into scourge zombies one by one. The prince claimed it was better that the citizens die by his hand than have them serve the Dreadlord in undeath. After purging the city of its citizens, Arthas caught up to Mal'Ganis. He laid eyes on the demon for the first time, a monster with hooves, wings, horns, and skin like stone. Arthas drowned out his fear with rage and fury. But the Dreadlord fled to Northrend, telling the prince that it was there where they would settle their battle, and it was there where Arthas' destiny awaited. Arthas swore to hunt Mal'Ganis to the ends of the earth if need be. 3 days after the culling, Jaina and Uther looked through the ruined city. They learned that Arthas had taken the Lordaeron fleet to Northrend. The prophet Medivh contacted Jaina, informing her that it was now too late for Arthas to save their kingdoms, and that responsibility now fell to her. She was instructed to bring her people west to Kalimdor. Northrend. On the way to the frozen continent to the north, Arthas slept and dreamt of Invincible. He recalled pulling his sword and running it into the beloved horse's heart, only this time the sword was different. It was a two-handed sword, and inscribed with runes. Furthermore, Invincible didn't die from the piercing. Rather, it was healed, stronger than ever. Then Arthas awoke. Upon arrival in Northrend, Arthas encountered frost wolves and Drakari ice trolls before he came across Muradin Bronzebeard, his former martial instructor. Muradin had been in Northrend with the Explorers League, searching for a powerful runeblade named Frostmourne, but his forces had been separated and he was in need of assistance. They chose to work together and accomplish the two goals of obtaining Frostmourne and slaying Mal'Ganis. After joining forces and solidifying a foothold in Northrend, an airship arrived, with orders to recall the expedition under the king's authority. Uther had convinced King Tyrannus that Arthas' venture into Northrend was folly, and he was ordered to return. Arthas couldn't come up empty after all the things he had seen and done. He responded to the orders by enlisting troll and ogre mercenary help to burn their ships, preventing any way for the fleet to return to Lordaeron. He then told his soldiers the destruction of the ships was the sole doing of the mercenaries, and he ordered his troops to slay them, effectively covering his crimes. As Arthas turned his weapon on those who had aided him in his schemes, the weapon again lacked the light's glow. Muradin reprimanded the prince for his behavior. This wasn't the man Muradin had taught to fight. The dwarf asked Arthas if vengeance was the only thing that mattered to him now. Their conversation was interrupted when Mal'Ganis sprung an ambush on the now trapped Lordaeron soldiers. Frostmourne. With no other option for survival, Arthas desperately searched for Frostmourne in hopes that it could turn the tide of battle in their favor. Arthas and Muradin found a vault guarded by icy elementals who warned Arthas against claiming the weapon. They aimed to protect the desperate prince from the cursed Frostmourne, but Arthas recognized the weapon from his dream. It would be the salvation for his people. Muradin read the warning inscribed on the weapon's holding place. Whomsoever takes up this blade shall wield power eternal. Just as the blade rends flesh, so must power scar the spirit. Understanding that the weapon was cursed, Muradin advised that they leave it be and fight as they were. Once again, Arthas ignored the counsel of those who knew better, claiming he would bear any curse if it would save his homeland. Arthas felt the weight of the atrocities he had seen and that of those he had committed. He couldn't turn away. The Lordaeron prince lamented the scarred soul he now carried. He reached for Frostmourne, in hopes that it would grant him his vengeance and make things right for his people. As Arthas claimed the cursed weapon, spears of ice erupted from its holding place, piercing Muradin and apparently killing him. For a moment, Arthas felt remorse. He felt the light return to him and flow through his hands. He thought for a moment to heal Muradin, but he got swayed by a whisper in the back of his mind. The light was snuffed out as he gripped Frostmourne once more. It felt as if the weapon was made for him. Arthas returned to his camp with Frostmourne and an altered appearance. His blonde hair was now starting to turn white, his skin a pale gray, and his eyes now possessed an eerie, dull glow. Though he had lost his friend and teacher Muradin, Arthas was still set on killing Mal'Ganis. The new weapon was perfect. His already impressive combat prowess instantly had skyrocketed. He easily fought past the Scourge, as well as Nerubians, Drakari trolls, and corrupted servants of the Titan Keeper Loken. When Arthas finally caught up to Mal'Ganis, the demon revealed that they were both working for the Dark Lord now. Namely, Ner'zhul, the Lich King. The Lich King spoke to Arthas through Frostmourne, and instructed him to claim his vengeance on Mal'Ganis. Mal'Ganis was shocked by this icy betrayal, and was slain by the order of the Dark Lord he had assisted. Ner'zhul's fate. Following the Second War, many orcs and the newly created Death Knights contacted Ner'zhul on Draenor. They asked him to devise a new plan for their survival, and he did. Ner'zhul and Teron Gorefiend had their army collect artifacts from Azeroth that they needed to open portals to other planets. After they had gathered the required artifacts, soldiers of the Alliance, called the Sons of Lothar, pursued them to Draenor, aiming to stop them from invading and dooming other planets. Ner'zhul performed a mass portal opening, an event powerful enough to rip Draenor apart and send its pieces into the twisting nether. After realizing this, Ner'zhul dishonorably saved himself by killing one of his comrades and entering the portal. However, this portal sent him directly into the demon Kil'jaeden's clutches. Kil'jaeden began twisting and tormenting Ner'zhul's soul as a punishment for acting against his wishes. He then passed Ner'zhul's soul through death and bound it to a suit of armor. He placed him on Azeroth, entombed in ice atop the Frozen Throne. The Frozen Throne itself was an otherworldly spire of ice in the Icecrown Glacier. Ner'zhul was now the Lich King, a tool of the Burning Legion designed to weaken Azeroth for future Legion invasion. Kil'jaeden and Archimonde placed the demonic Dreadlords in charge of overseeing Ner'zhul. The Lich King had the power to raise dead beings into undead scourge. He began working with the exiled necromancer Kael'Thas to accomplish his goals. Ner'zhul the Lich King's plot. Phase 1. Ner'zhul had his own plans, namely to betray the Burning Legion. He wished to stand against the demons and prevent them from accomplishing their conquest of Azeroth. To do so, he would first need a champion to enact his will on the world. So from the Frozen Throne, atop the Icecrown Glacier, the Lich King cracked his icy tomb and sent out the weapon Frostmourne. Then, he began the influencing events that would lead his chosen champion Arthas into claiming the cursed weapon. Ner'zhul's voice tore at Arthas' last remnants of sanity, effectively turning him into a pawn of the Lich King. Arthas sailed to Lordaeron, where he had an audience with his father, King Terenas. There, Arthas committed patricide and unleashed his scourge on the realm. Through the chaos of the scourge invasion on the capital, Arthas escaped. Arthas returned to the grave of his horse, who he had mercifully killed 7 years prior. Wielding the dark necromantic powers of Frostmourne, Arthas commanded the dead horse to rise. The animal was resurrected in an undead skeletal form. Arthas had helped bring the horse into the world. Then he had helped it leave. Now he had brought it back, invincible. The Scourge Campaign. Arthas was now an agent of the Lich King, and he led an undead campaign in Eastern Kingdoms. The northern lands had already been weakened by the plague of undeath, and now their morale was shattered after their prince had murdered their beloved king. The forces of Lordaeron were at a small fraction of their former strength. Arthas joined up with the Lich King's Scourge forces, who were presently being led by the demon dreadlord Tychondrius. He informed Arthas that Frostmourne had taken away his soul, and with it his capacity for guilt and remorse. Still, deep down, Arthas felt a tiny feeling that seemed to contradict this. Tychondrius instructed Arthas to rally the Cult of the Damned members who were in hiding after Kael'Thas's death. Arthas and the rallied cult members then moved to Anderhall to recover Kael'Thas's remains. Once there, Arthas was opposed by one of the first ever paladins, Gavinrad the Dire. Arthas slayed his former brother-in-arms and claimed Kael'Thas's remains. Kael'Thas's ghost then revealed himself only to Arthas and began to guide the Scourge leader. For now, they needed to find a way to preserve Kael'Thas's remains for travel. Arthas unwittingly attempted to steal the urn containing his father's ashes from the Paladin Order. In this effort, Arthas slayed Paladins of the Silver Hand, Bellador the Bright, Sage Truthbearer, and finally his lifelong mentor, Uther Lightbringer. After claiming the urn, Kael'Thas's ghost informed Arthas that the Dreadlords weren't entirely allies of the Lich King. Rather, they were in charge of his imprisonment and binding to the Burning Legion. Kael'Thas said he would reveal the details after his coming resurrection. In order to reanimate Kael'Thas with his power intact, they needed a site of great power. Learning this, Arthas began marching on the High Elf capital, Kael'Thas, and the Sunwell. The Scarring of Silvermoon. Arthas led his army into High Elven territory. Following the advice of Kael'Thas's ghost, Arthas set up camp and prepared to lay siege to the High Elven capital. Here he met his opponent, Ranger General of Silvermoon, Sylvanas Windrunner. The Ranger General was the younger sister of Illyria Windrunner, Alliance hero during the Second War. Sylvanas and her fellow archers persistently harassed Arthas and his scourge at any opportunity, escaping before the undead could reach her and her troops. Sylvanas slowed Arthas' progress, but he still managed to advance deeper into elf territory, destroying the first of 2 elf gates guarding Silvermoon. Arthas never should have found out the secrets required to pass through the gates, but he had been informed by the Silvermoon betrayer, Darkhan Drothir. The traitor told Arthas about the Key of the 3 Moons, a key composed of 3 moon crystals that he would need to obtain. To prevent Arthas from aggressing any further, Sylvanas destroyed the only bridge that passed over a deep river. The Scourge army piled their undead bodies into the river until it was crossable. Then they collected the 3 moon crystals, the keys to opening the second elf gate. Arthas opened the second elf gate, still being harassed by the Ranger General's forces. During the prolonged skirmish, the 2 commanders developed a deep-seated hatred for each other. Sylvanas continued to assault the Scourge camps as they approached Silvermoon. She attempted to send a warning to the capital to request reinforcements, but Arthas had his gargoyles swiftly dispatch all her elven messengers. Both commanders knew it had come time for their true confrontation, so the Ranger General made her final stand at the gates of Silvermoon. She was defeated, and welcomed her swift demise, but Arthas had grown to hate her so much that he couldn't grant her that. Instead, Arthas slayed the High Elf General and resurrected her into undeath as a Banshee, servant of the Scourge and the Lich King. Now, as an unwilling servant, Sylvanas assisted Arthas in breaching Silvermoon's walls and accessing the Sunwell. She deeply wished to resist the command she was given, yet she could not. She had hated Arthas as she lived, but it was nothing compared to how much she hated him now. The Scourge army, bolstered by Sylvanas and her freshly turned forces, rampaged through the city until they faced the High Elf King, Anasterian Sunstrider, an incredibly powerful magic wielder. After a skirmish, the king was forced to retreat to Kael'Thas, the island where the Sunwell was located. The final 2 obstacles between Arthas and the Sunwell were the moat around Kael'Thas and a second engagement with Anasterian Sunstrider. This time, the High Elven King wielded Fellow Malorn, a sacred High Elven sword. Arthas used Frostmourn's icy powers to create a path of frost across the moat. He then engaged the High Elf King in combat. He shattered Fellow Malorn and killed the High Elf King. He then used the Sunwell's energies to resurrect Kael'Thas as a Lich. After witnessing the power of the undead Banshee Sylvanas, Arthas began to make more Banshees, placing her in charge of leading the unit. Aftermath of the Scourge Siege of Silvermoon. The Scourge army had left behind a path of death and plague in their wake, poisoning the ground they marched upon. The dead path stretched from Deathholm through Silvermoon and into Kael'Thas, leaving a dead scar on the land. Prince Kael'Thas returned to Silvermoon and discovered the atrocities that Arthas had committed against his people. He retrieved the broken Fellow Malorn, which he knew grew in power each time it was reforged. Kael then renamed his people from the High Elves, Quel'Dorei, to the Blood Elves, Sindorei, in honor of all the bloodshed their people had experienced. The Blood Elves still required magic to fuel their lives, but their Sunwell was now full of corrupted fel magic, which turned the Blood Elves' eyes green. Ner'zhul the Lich King's plot, Phase 2. The freshly resurrected Lich Kael'Thas informed Arthas of Ner'zhul's hidden plot against the Burning Legion, and he reiterated how the Dreadlords were not their allies. Now, the initial threats against the Scourge were largely disposed of, namely the High Elves and the human forces of Lordaeron. Arthas and Kael'Thas were to initiate the second phase of the plan, where they summoned the demon responsible for starting the Burning Legion invasion, Archimonde. To do so, they overtook an orc encampment where orcish warlocks maintained a functioning demonic portal. After taking control of the demon portal, Kael'Thas contacted the demon lord Archimonde. Kael'Thas is told that they will require a lost tome of Medivh's if they were to summon a being as powerful as Archimonde. The tome was in Dalaran. The Banshee Sylvanas had remained with the Scourge forces. She taunted Arthas when he showed pain, recalling his childhood visits to the magical city. Somehow, she had been able to maintain a modicum of her will, insignificant as it was at this point. Jaina and Kael'Thas were in Dalaran prior to the siege. Kael cursed Arthas for his assault on Silvermoon and reprimanded Jaina for believing there was any humanity left in him. They both departed prior to the siege. Kael'Thas returned to Silvermoon, while Jaina brought her troops to Kalimdor. The Scourge Siege of Dalaran. Arthas and Kael'Thas stood against Archmage Antonidas and the Kirin Tor of Dalaran. The Scourge managed to kill 3 Archmages that were maintaining the defensive barrier to the magical city. Interestingly, one of these Archmages was named Fordred Aran, who was potentially related to Neelis Aran, Medivh's father. The Scourge forces entered the Violet Citadel and slayed Archmage Antonidas, claiming the tome required for Archimonde's summoning. With assistance from the Legion's lesser demons, the Scourge commanders succeed in summoning Archimonde. At this moment, the Scourge had fulfilled their initial purpose in weakening Azeroth and calling in the Legion invasion. So, as far as the Burning Legion was concerned, the Scourge was worthless, and the Dreadlords were given full control over their forces. Archimonde started his invasion by leveling what remained of Dalaran. This began the events of the Battle for Mount Hyjal. Those detailed events are outside the scope of this video. However, they occur in the western land of Kalimdor, which explains why Prophet Medivh was attempting to convince the Horde and Alliance leaders to head west. The battle for Mount Hyjal concludes with Archimonde's defeat through the combined efforts of Thrall's new Horde, Jaina's remaining Alliance forces, and the Night Elves. Ner'zhul the Lich King's plot, Phase 3. The Legion's failure to defeat the defenders of Azeroth was in part orchestrated by the Lich King Ner'zhul. Kael'Thas briefly teleported Arthas to Kalimdor. Arthas then fought Illidan Stormrage, a night elf recently freed from his 10,000-year imprisonment. He had been imprisoned following the War of the Ancients and the shattering of Azeroth's main continent, but now he had been freed in light of the most recent Legion threat. Arthas and Illidan fought deftly, yet they found they were evenly matched. During the fight, Arthas sensed Illidan's insatiable hunger for power. Arthas told Illidan that the Dreadlord Tichondrius was in charge of the Legion forces in Kalimdor, and he was empowered by the Skull of Gul'dan. Both Illidan and Arthas would benefit from the Legion's downfall. The Lich King would be free from the Dreadlord's control, while Illidan, the Night Elves, and their land would no longer be hounded by demons. So Illidan took the bait and hunted down the Skull of Gul'dan. Its power twisted his body to resemble that of a demon. Illidan used his newfound power to slay Tichondrius, stop the fell corruption, and give the defenders of Azeroth an upper hand. Yet, for all of his efforts, he was looked down upon and banished from Night Elf society. The Night Elves sacrificed Teldrassil, the World Tree, and lost their immortality to defeat Archimonde. Ner'zhul's plot was completed. The Legion was defeated and largely removed from Azeroth, as were the Lordaeron and High Elf forces. The planet was ripe for scourging. If Ner'zhul succeeded in scourging the planet, his undead army would be so powerful the Burning Legion would never be able to claim their prized Azeroth. Kael'Thas and Sylvanas came across the remnants of the Legion's Dreadlord leaders, Balnazar, Varamothras, and Deathrok. They seemed out of sorts, having lost their commander, Archimonde. Suddenly, Arthas approached and launched an attack on the Dreadlords, weakened without their overlord. The Dreadlords fled, leaving Arthas and the Lich King in control of the Scourge army. With that, Arthas claimed himself the king in Lordaeron. Unexpectedly, Arthas twisted in pain, which Sylvanas took great pleasure in seeing. His dark powers quickly faded. At the time, the cause for this was mysterious, but it would later be revealed that Illidan was channeling a spell that would crack both Northrend and the Frozen Throne, causing the Lich King's power to seep out. Sylvanas noticed Arthas' diminished power, as well as his diminished control over the undead. The Forsaken Uprising. Later, the now forceless Dreadlords contacted Sylvanas, and together they conspired against the ailing Arthas in an attempt to wrest back control of the Scourge. The Dreadlords revealed that the Lich King was indeed getting weaker. As his power faded, so too did Arthas' and his control over Sylvanas and the undead. The weakened Arthas began having visions of a suit of armor frozen in ice atop the Frozen Throne, The Lich King spoke to Arthas, warning him that danger was coming for the Frozen Throne, and there wasn't much time. If the Lich King were destroyed, Arthas would surely die as well. Arthas had to obey his master and return to Northrend to defend the Frozen Throne. In the remnants of Lordaeron Palace, Arthas contacted Kael'Thas, who expressed genuine concern about Arthas' well-being. The two started making arrangements to return to Northrend when they were interrupted by Sylvanas and the 3 remaining Dreadlords. Arthas reached for his weapon. He recognized that not only was he weakened, but Frostmourne itself was weak. Its runic glow was faint. The surprise attack forced Kael'Thas to cover Arthas as he fled. The only advantage Arthas now had was knowledge of the corridors of his childhood home. As Arthas escaped, he witnessed undead forces fighting amongst each other. Apparently some had remained loyal to the Lich King and himself, but others were following their own orders. A group of abominations and ghouls rushed at Arthas, but he was seemingly rescued by Sylvanas and her unit of banshees. The banshees led Arthas to a spot where they were safe, but the Lich King quickly informed him that he was indeed in danger. It was too late. Sylvanas drew her bow on Arthas and shot him through the shoulder with a paralytic arrow. Arthas collapsed as Sylvanas drew her dagger. The Scourge Knight told Sylvanas to finish him off, which she of course found amusing. Back when Arthas had the option of killing Sylvanas, he chose to create an undead servant instead, so in turn Sylvanas refused to show Arthas any mercy. However, Kael'Thas appeared just in time to stave off Sylvanas' final blow and save Arthas' life. The Banshee retreated from the Lich, swearing she would never stop hunting Arthas. She and her banshees were now entirely free from the Lich King's control. Later, Varimathras battled Sylvanas for control of the undead forces in Lordaeron. She had her banshees possess nearby trolls, ogres, murlocs, and bandits to defeat the Dreadlord. She was victorious, but spared Varimathras as he promised to help her defeat the remaining Dreadlords. He held this promise, and Sylvanas, the Dark Lady, defeated Deathrok and drove Balnazar into hiding. Still, she didn't fully trust Varimathras. Nevertheless, together they gathered the undead beings free of the Lich King's control under a new faction, the Forsaken. Elsewhere, Arthas put Kael'Thas in charge of northern eastern kingdoms, now the Plaguelands, as a thanks for saving his life. But he wasn't in the clear yet. The Lich King was still in danger, and he had to return to Northrend immediately. The race for the Frozen Throne. Arthas could feel the Lich King's peril the very second he set foot on Northrend. He was quickly beset upon by a group of Dragonhawks, the chosen mount of the newly dubbed Blood Elves, led by Kael'Thas. Arthas fought off the Blood Elves. He and Frostmourne recovered some of their strength by draining the souls of those he killed. Then, he raised the dead into Scourge soldiers to help with his expedition to the Frozen Throne. His force joined up with undead Nerubians led by Anubarak, sent by the Lich King. Their introduction was cut short as they were interrupted by Prince Kael'Thas himself, the Blood Elf leader burning with hatred. Arthas and Kael exchanged hateful taunts before Kael revealed that Illidan's Stormrage was the real threat coming for Icecrown. Kael'Thas teleported away after stalling Arthas long enough to give Illidan a head start. Anubarak suggested that they catch up through the underground networks of Azjol Nerub. Azjol Nerub was once the underground kingdom of the Nerubians, but now is just a dark, twisting cavern filled with many horrors. Near the entrance to the underground tunnels were a couple obstacles. These were Meridan's leaderless dwarf soldiers and a blue dragonflight encampment. Arthas managed to slay the blue dragon Sapphiron and subsequently raise it into undeath as a frostworm. The undead dragon helped the Scourge forces clear a path through the dwarven remnants of Meridan's army. Arthas recognized that the large undead dragon would serve little purpose in the small confines of the tunnels and left the frostworm outside to guard their rear. Within the tunnels of the Old Kingdom, Arthas and his forces were beset upon by the old god servants, the Forgotten Ones. Weakened as he was, and aware that he needed to conserve his energy for his coming fights against Kael and Illidan, Arthas had no choice but to flee. Arthas found a new path out of the underground tunnels. As they emerged from the underground kingdom, they found that Illidan had already set up camp at the base of Icecrown. Illidan himself had traveled to Outland after the events of Hyjal. There he had made a deal with Kil'jaeden. If he were to destroy the Lich King, he would be granted even more power than he had gained after consuming the skull of Gul'dan. Also, he would avoid the demon's wrath. The demonic commander demanded that Illidan destroy the Lich King and put an end to Ner'zhul's plotting. Illidan had previously attempted to destroy the Frozen Throne by casting a long-range spell. At that time, he only managed to crack the throne, causing both the Lich King and Arthas to lose a portion of their necromantic power. This attempt ultimately ended in failure when the Night Elves interrupted his spellcasting due to its destructive impact on the planet. Kil'jaeden had given Illidan one more chance to destroy the Lich King, so Illidan and Kael'Thas moved their forces to Northrend to engage the Lich King in person. The Lich King gave Arthas all the remaining strength he could spare. Arthas challenged Illidan's forces in order to save his master. Before Arthas could make his way to Illidan himself, however, he was stopped by Kael'Thas. Arthas recalled how scared he was when Kael had caught him with Jaina when they were younger. Things were quite different then. The two battled, Arthas wielding Frostmourne and Kael'Thas wielding the strengthened fellow Malorn. Arthas focused on upsetting Kael, bringing up Jaina as an attempt to gain the upper hand. But it backfired, as the elf informed Arthas how much she loathed him now. For a time, Kael had the advantage. Even so, Kael didn't have to win. He simply needed to buy Illidan time to assault the Frozen Throne and destroy the Lich King. Arthas was able to recover, using a reversal that Muradin had once taught him years ago. Arthas was nearly able to strike the death blow, but Kael'Thas teleported away, leaving only 3 words behind. "She hates you." Arthas was momentarily enraged, then he called for Invincible to resume his search for Illidan. When he caught up to Illidan, Arthas mistook the once Night Elf for a Dreadlord. Illidan was now some kind of demonic mortal hybrid, a curse that he now bore after claiming the skull of Gul'dan. Arthas mocked Illidan's new appearance, knowing that he had been the one responsible for sending Illidan after the skull. Illidan didn't seem to mind. Rather, he seemed proud of who he was. Illidan sought to avoid his demise by destroying the Lich King. Arthas sought to avoid his own demise by saving the Lich King. The two were at odds, so they crossed blades. Frostmourne against the twin blades of Azzinoth. Both were more powerful now than their previous bout, but Arthas' time was short. The Scourge Knight managed to open a gash in the Demon Hunter. Illidan retaliated by raining Fellfire upon Arthas, engulfing him in green flames. As Illidan moved in for a kill, the Lich King's champion rose Frostmourne in a last-ditch defense. The icy rune blade pierced Illidan's torso, sending him crashing into the snow. Arthas left Illidan to die in the frost, and progressed toward the Frozen Throne. He followed Ner'zhul's beckoning voice to the Lich King's armor. Frostmourne glowed as the Lich King demanded that the blade be returned. Arthas shattered the icy tomb that contained the Lich King's armor. The black, spiked helmet fell to his feet. Arthas donned the helm and allowed it to fill him with the Lich King's consciousness, power, and understanding. The Lich King Ner'zhul had now obtained a new vessel to operate in the physical realm. They didn't battle for control of the body, though. They had combined. Arthas and Ner'zhul together, the Lich King. Then, the Lich King fell dormant atop the Frozen Throne. He needed time to sort out who or what he was now. Arthas' consciousness now contained 3 sides. There was the man, Arthas, the orc, Ner'zhul, and all that remained of his goodness, the child Arthas. Arthas purged what remained of his humanity, allowing Frostmourne to drink what remained of his soul, killing the child. Ner'zhul, the orc, applauded this act, only to be destroyed himself. Finally, there was only Arthas, the Lich King. The Schism of the Silver Hand. As the Lich King remained dormant, Kael'Thas oversaw the developments in the Plague Lands from his floating fortress, Naxxramas. Kael'Thas' biggest challenge was a man named Alexandros Morgraine, paladin of the Silver Hand, veteran of the Second War, and wielder of the Ashbringer. The Ashbringer was a weapon forged in Ironforge from an otherworldly artifact which was infused with holy light. This made it particularly effective against the undead. The legendary sword destroyed any scourge it touched, scorching them and leaving behind only ashes. The magnificent feats and heroic acts Alexandros performed granted him heavy respect and a leadership role within the Order of the Silver Hand. He came to be known as the Ashbringer himself. Along with one of the first ever paladins, Saidan Dathrahan, the Knights of the Silver Hand operated with the singular purpose of defeating the Scourge army. But this faction would be infiltrated by the Dreadlord Balnazar. Balnazar had not been slain during his battle with Sylvanas, but he no longer had much influence over the local undead. With no army of his own, the Dreadlord took to underhanded tactics to increase his power. By killing Saidan Dathrahan and subsequently impersonating him, The Dreadlord gave orders to the Paladins of the Silver Hand that served his ends. But if he wanted full control of the Paladins, he would have to find a way to kill Alexandros. Alexandros Mograine had 2 sons, Renault and Darien, who were also Paladins in service of the Silver Hand. Alexandros inadvertently doted on the younger brother Darien, as he reminded him of his late wife. Renault developed a darkness within himself, begrudging his younger brother and resenting his father. Renault also served under Saidan Dathrohan, who was now Balnazar, and over time, he was manipulated into craving his father's respected position in the Order. Balnazar convinced Renault that the best thing for the Order was to put himself in a position of power, but Alexandros was standing in their way. The Ashbringer's corruption. Dreadlord Balnazar, disguised as Saidan Dathrohan, gave Renault Mograine an order. He was to kill his father, Alexandros. Renault led Alexandros and his advisor Fairbanks into the ruins of Stratholme by claiming that Darien had been captured there. While in the ruined city, Alexandros and Fairbanks rode into a Scourge ambush orchestrated by Balnazar. Their only option was to fight their way out. The Ashbringer cleaved through the undead forces, while Fairbanks provided what support he could. He fell behind. When Renault was alone with Alexandros, he murdered his father using the Ashbringer. This betrayal corrupted the weapon and trapped Alexandros' spirit inside. High Inquisitor Fairbanks caught up to Alexandros just in time to witness the betrayal firsthand, and he reported this back to the Knights of the Silver Hand. However, he was silenced by Dathrohan under the guise of quarantine for potential plague infection. The information of this traitorous event splintered the Order. One faction followed Balnazar disguised as Saidan Dathrohan. They called themselves the Scarlet Crusade. Under this new leadership, the Crusade turned corrupt, and their goals shifted. Through suspicion and paranoia, they turned their blades against all things that weren't a part of their organization. The other faction held true to the tenets of the Holy Light. They were called the Argent Dawn. Later, the Scourge recovered Alexandros' body. Alexandros Mograine was raised into undeath and placed inside Naxxramas as the leader of the 4 Horsemen. Within the Scarlet Crusade, Renault was promoted for his actions and stationed within the Scarlet Monastery. Fairbanks died of his infection after being abandoned in quarantine. The first battle for Light's Hope Chapel. Alexandros' second son, Darien, joined the new Paladin sect, the Argent Dawn, formed by those who were disgusted by the path that the Scarlet Crusade was taking under the impersonated Saidan Dathrohan. The Argent Dawn created their base of operations at a chapel in the east of the Plague Lands, Light's Hope Chapel. This tiny chapel in the middle of nowhere held a secret. Namely, the tombs beneath the chapel housed thousands of the honored dead of Lordaeron. These powerful deceased warriors and soldiers could have spelled doom for the world if they all fell into Scourge hands. So these bodies were secretly transported to Light's Hope Chapel at the beginning of the Scourge invasion. With help from a few of the members of the Argent Dawn, Darien was able to infiltrate Naxxramas and reclaim the corrupted Ashbringer. He was surprised to find Alexandros' spirit within. Alexandros requested that Darien bring him to see Renault. When the family was reunited, Alexandros' spirit manifested and beheaded Renault in an act of justice. But the father's spirit remained trapped within the corrupted weapon. Darien spoke with the spirit of Fairbanks in a dream. He was advised to seek out the paladin Tyrion Fordring, who was living in exile. Tyrion informed Darien that the only way to free his father's spirit and cleanse the corruption was to perform an act of compassion greater than the act of betrayal that had defiled it. This vague information left Darien at a loss, but he had little time to ponder. The secret of Light's Hope Chapel had gotten out, and a Scourge force was mounting an assault on the Argent Dawn. Darien returned to the chapel to fight off the undead. Darien saw that the Argent Dawn was overwhelmed, and they would soon lose this battle. Even after Tyrion arrived to aid in the defense, the tombs were still at risk. All the souls stored and those who died protecting the consecrated land would soon be turned over to the Scourge. Tyrion's words ran through Darien's head, and he knew he would have to make a great sacrifice. Darien impaled himself on the corrupted Ashbringer, freeing Alexandros' spirit along with all the other righteous souls near the chapel. The righteous spirits fended off the undead, but both Darien's body and the curiously still corrupted Ashbringer fell into Scourge clutches. The second battle for Light's Hope Chapel. The Lich King awoke. He sent his Scourge to assault the Alliance and Horde forces in their capital cities, His plan was to draw the ire of Azeroth's greatest combatants, luring them to Northrend so that he could turn them into his undead champions. Furthermore, he sent his Death Knight forces to attack New Avalon in the Plague Lands, a small city guarded by Scarlet Crusaders. Freshly trained Death Knights slaughtered their way through the city, carving a path to their target, Light's Hope Chapel. After the first battle for Light's Hope Chapel, Darion Mograin's body was taken in by the Scourge, and he was raised into undeath as a Death Knight commander, wielding the corrupted Ashbringer. He was now the Lich King's right hand in this attack. Light's Hope Chapel was a place of significance to Darion Mograin, as it was the location he had given his life to protect. The Lich King chose Darion to lead this assault in the hope that it would draw out a certain individual who operated in the Plague Lands. Tyrion Fordring, who had developed a connection to Darion prior to the first battle for Light's Hope, stood against the Death Knights. If the Lich King could kill him here, then he would have peace of mind knowing that the powerful paladin would not be able to participate in the coming invasion of Northrend. Tyrion and the Argent Dawn defeated the Death Knights. Still, the Death Knights did their job in drawing out Tyrion. The Lich King himself appeared and revealed that the Death Knights were simply fodder. This upset Darion Mograin, who struck out at his master. The Lich King simply knocked his Death Knight aside and began to attack Tyrion, draining his soul with Frostmourne. Darion eventually managed to break the Lich King's control and threw the corrupted Ashbringer to Tyrion. This act of compassion in Tyrion's light cleansed the weapon. Tyrion broke Frostmourne's spell and drove the Lich King away using the renewed Ashbringer. The remaining paladins of the Silver Hand and the Argent Dawn pledged themselves to the hero Tyrion Fordring, creating a new faction called the Argent Crusade. Simultaneously, the remaining Death Knights pledged to follow Darion Mograin as the Knights of the Ebon Blade, a faction of Death Knights free from the Lich King's control. Both factions vowed to see the Lich King destroyed. The invasion of Northrend. Alliance and Horde adventurers traveled to Northrend for a few reasons, but the main threat was the Lich King. Garrosh Hellscream, son of Gromosh Hellscream, led the forces of the Horde expedition. King Varian Rin and Bolvar Fordragon led the Alliance forces, the Valiant's expedition through Northrend. After stopping the crazed aspect of the blue dragonflight, Malagos, from draining the magic from the planet, adventurers crossed with the Lich King's forces at Icecrown Citadel's Wrathgate. Icecrown Citadel itself began as a pillar of ice that housed the armor of the Lich King at its peak, called the Frozen Throne. At one point, Illidan had channeled a spell intended to shatter the spire, which left a fissure in the center of Northrend. The spire remained, however, and over time, the spire was reinforced with Serenite, the black blood of Yogg-Saron, which was rumored to induce insanity. And Grathar, the Wrathgate. Alliance and Horde forces gathered for their assault on Icecrown Citadel, the Alliance under Bolvar Fordragon, and the Horde behind Varrock Saurfang's son, Draynosh, both of whom focused their forces on the Scourge rather than each other. There was a tenuous, uneasy truce between the factions at this point. As the mortal forces of Azeroth reached the foot of the Wrathgate, the Lich King himself stepped forward. Then, unseen forces of the Forsaken struck. Grand Apothecary Putris filled the battlefield with the Forsaken's newly developed plague, fatal to both living and undead. The Lich King fell back, while the Horde, Alliance, and Scourge forces were enveloped by the deadly green fog. Red Dragon Aspect Alexstrasza and her Dragonflight interceded swiftly before the plague could spread any further throughout the region. They used their enchanted flames to cleanse the plague from the air. However, the combatants had all been killed, and the bodies of both Bolvar and Draynosh had mysteriously disappeared. Both factions demanded an explanation from the Forsaken for what had transpired at the Wrathgate. Though Sylvanas had overseen the creation of the new plague, she was unaware that it was going to be used in such a manner. Furthermore, she contacted Thrall and claimed she had been ousted from Undercity due to some type of rebellion. The ones responsible for the rebellion and the new plague's use were the Dreadlord Varamathras and Grand Apothecary Putris, who now fought in Undercity for control of the Forsaken forces. Varamathras had convinced Putris that betraying the Banshee Queen was in their best interest, since they could reunite with the Burning Legion if their plot was successful. However, the Horde returned to the Undercity, fought Varamathras, quelled the coup, and regained control of the city. Meanwhile, the Alliance scoured the sewers for Putris, finding him and defeating him. The Horde and Alliance forces came to blows as they came across each other in the Undercity throne room. Their trust in each other was broken after the Wrathgate, and Alliance leader Varian declared war on the Horde. Before the fighting could continue, however, Jaina interceded and separated the sides. At this point, the heroes of Azeroth commenced their raid upon Ulduar and the prison of Yogg-Saron. They succeeded and narrowly avoided the planetary wipeout and re-origination from Algalon the Observer. The Argent Tournament. Now that the planetary threats within the Eye of Eternity and Ulduar had been dealt with, Azeroth's champions turned their focus once again toward the Lich King. However, Tyrion Fordring of the Argent Crusade asked the Horde and Alliance leaders to withhold their forces for the moment. Tyrion found it suspicious that the Lich King's strongest forces had been holed up in the Citadel for so long. It was as if they wanted an all-out siege. In truth, that is what the Lich King wanted, so he could turn all the Horde and Alliance forces into Scourge in one fell swoop. The Knights of the Ebon Blade and the Paladins of the Argent Crusade deduced the Lich King's plan. They figured that the Scourge forces would indeed incur heavy losses in the case of a siege, but so long as they also inflicted heavy losses, their numbers would never dwindle. Any freshly slain enemies would turn into new Scourge allies. Therefore, a large-numbered siege would be a losing battle of attrition due to the very nature of the Lich King's power. The only way to defeat the Scourge capital would be with a small strike force of highly skilled soldiers. In order to select those worthy for the raid of Icecrown Citadel, the Argent Crusade held the Argent Tournament, an open test for any who desired to prove themselves in combat. Through the events of the tournament, Tyrion was able to select the chosen few who would assault Icecrown Citadel. When the Knights of the Ebon Blade and the Argent Crusade started their assault on the gates of Icecrown Citadel, Sylvanas led a covert operation into the dungeons of the Citadel. Their goal was to access the Halls of Reflection and find out anything that could weaken the Lich King. The dungeons of Icecrown Citadel. The Forge of Souls stood in the way of the Halls of Reflection, so covert adventurers entered the Forge and cleared a way toward their second location. They were forced to combat Bronjam and the Devourer of Souls. Bronjam was a follower of Kael'Thas and was taught how to convert souls into fuel for the Scourge war machines. He guarded the Forge of Souls. The Devourer of Souls was created by the Lich King himself to ensure no scrap of soul went to waste or escaped the Forge. The Devourer hunts and consumes any soul that goes astray. After those two were slain, Sylvanas set up her base in the Forge of Souls, and the adventurers moved to the Pit of Saran for their next task. The Pit of Saran housed a Serenite mining operation. The three leaders of the operation were Forge Master Garfrost, the Necromancer Crick, and Scourge Lord Tyrannus. Forge Master Garfrost was notable for his skilled blacksmithing of Serenite into Scourge weapons of pain and death. The undead gnomish Necromancer Crick managed the undead workers in the Pit of Saran. He oversaw the operations from atop his abomination Ick. After Ick was slain, Crick panicked and begged Sylvanas for his life. He revealed that Frostmourne was the key to the Lich King's fate. Before more could be revealed, Crick was slain by Scourge Lord Tyrannus. Scourge Lord Tyrannus earned his title after he slayed Garfrost when he was still a living giant. Tyrannus protected the Pit of Saran with his mount, the Frostworm Rhymefang. Tyrannus dismounted to battle the adventurers, but upon his death, he instructed Rhymefang to warn the Scourge leaders. This attracted Sindragosa, who prepared a frost breath to destroy the intruders. In the nick of time, the adventurers were protected by Sylvanas. After Sindragosa left, the squad gained access to the Halls of Reflection. Upon entry to the Halls of Reflection, the adventurers and Sylvanas saw Frostmourne suspiciously unguarded. As the Dark Lady approached the blade, the spirit of Uther Lightbringer emerged to warn her against touching the rune blade. Uther went on to inform the listeners that after the Lich King was destroyed, someone else would need to take his place, as Arthas may be responsible for keeping the Scourge from rampaging throughout the lands. Finally, Uther informed Sylvanas that the Lich King could only be defeated at the place where he was created, the Frozen Throne. The Lich King himself interrupted the conversation and summoned the Death Knights Falric and Marwyn to deal with the intruders. Falric and Marwyn were the commanders for Arthas' forces during his first expedition to Northrend. They, like many others, were turned into undead Scourge by Frostmourne and now served. As adventurers fought off the two commanders, Sylvanas pursued the Lich King. After the adventurers caught up to Sylvanas, they quickly learned that Uther had been right, and the Lich King could not be defeated here. Their only choice was to escape. The Lich King pursued them all through the Halls of Reflection. The adventurers were able to narrowly escape as the Horde gunship, Orgrim's Hammer, sealed off the passageway leading out of the dungeon. Alliance operatives conducted a similar mission through the dungeons of Icecrown Citadel, following Jaina Proudmoore instead of Sylvanas Windrunner. Ultimately, they had obtained important information. The adventurers regrouped and prepared for their strike against the Frozen Throne. The Raid of Icecrown Citadel. The Wrath Gate was now blocked off, so the only remaining way to approach the Citadel was through a series of other gates. First was Mordrethar, the Death Gate. Next was Aldrethar, the Desolation Gate. And finally, Corbrethar, the Horror Gate. With the help of the Knights of the Ebon Blade and the Argent Dawn, the adventurers selected through the Argent Tournament entered the Citadel's halls. The Citadel contained the Lich King's strongest forces, starting with Lord Merogar. This bone wraith was constructed by the Lich King from the bodies of 1,000 slain adventurers, and served as a first test for the champions. Lady Deathwhisper was next. She was one of only a couple female liches, and served as the supreme overseer of the Cult of the Damned. Again, the Cult of the Damned was responsible for spreading the undead plague in the first place. Her defeat allowed access to an elevator that the infiltrators took to ascend the spire. Then, the adventurers gained access to their faction's gunship to climb higher still. The gunships for both factions came across one another. Unfortunately, since the brief trust between factions had been shattered at the Wrathgate, the factions engaged in an aerial combat. The faction that won the skirmish docked further up the spire, and the heroes engaged a familiar opponent. Draynosh Sourfang, former leader of the Horde forces at the Wrathgate, emerged as a newly created servant of the Lich King. Draynosh's body was never recovered following the Wrathgate incident. It turned out that the Scourge had recovered his body and brought it to the Lich King. Draynosh was risen into undeath, becoming a Death Knight of the Scourge. Then he was stationed in Icecrown Citadel as a defender of Deathbringer's Rise. The Argent Champion slayed him, and then returned his body to his father, High Overlord Sourfang. Within the spire of Icecrown Citadel were 3 wings. To the west were the Plague Works. The leader of the Scourge Plague Scientists was Professor Putricide, who was protected by his Scourge creations, Rotface and Festergut. Adventurers fought past Putricide's creations, and then turned his alchemical potions against him to defeat him. To the north of the spire was the Crimson Hall, home of the Sandlane race of Darkfallen. These Scourge undead blood elves returned after Kael and Illidan failed to destroy the Lich King during their race to the Frozen Throne. Adventurers had previously encountered the Blood Princes Keleseth, Valinar, and Taldaram from the Northrend locations Utgard Keep, Naxanar in the Borean Tundra, and An-Kahet, the Old Kingdom, respectively. Though all had been previously slain in these locations, they were now resurrected by the Blood Queen. Adventurers defeated the Council of Princes once again, and then challenged the Sandlane leader, Blood Queen Lanathel. With the Sandlane defeated, the champions returned to the central spire. On the spire's east side was the Frosthall Wings, defended by the Valkyr, Sister Svalna. Svalna and the Grand Champion of the Ebon Blade, Croc Scourgebane, once served together under the Lich King, but now Croc helped the adventurers defeat her. They then proceeded to encounter the imprisoned Green Dragon, Felithria Dreamwalker. The Green Dragon was heavily wounded, and the Lich King forces were hastening her demise in preparation to raise her as an undead drake. The Azeroth champions fought off the Scourge while they healed the dragon, saving her life. The path was open to the frostworm Sindragosa. Similar to what he had done with Sapphiron, Arthas had resurrected Sindragosa as a frostworm. Sindragosa herself was one of Malygos' consorts, who had once stood against Deathwing following his betrayal of his fellow Aspects. Using the Dragon Soul, Deathwing had hit her with a magical beam so powerful that it sent her from the Well of Eternity to the frozen north. There she died, frozen, struggling, and thinking only of her hatred. After Arthas raised her into undeath, she was placed in charge of the Frostbrood, an order of undead dragons under Scourge control. Now she stood in the adventurers' way, in defense of the Lich King. Adventurers first slay members of Sindragosa's Frostbrood, including Frostwing Whelps and the Drakes Spinestalker and Rhymefang, Scourgelord Tyrannus' mount. Then they defeat the Frostworm Sindragosa herself. All that remained in Icecrown Citadel was Arthas, the Lich King. The Fall of the Lich King. High Lord Tyrion Fordring confronts the Lich King, but he is quickly imprisoned in an ice tomb, leaving the adventurers with the responsibility of slaying the leader of the Scourge. Through an icy, grueling battle, the Lich King confirmed his suspicions. These champions truly were the strongest combatants on Azeroth. It was time for him to turn these warriors into his undead servants, giving him control of the strongest fighting force possible. But he was interrupted as the Holy Light freed Tyrion from his ice tomb. Tyrion Fordring used the Ashbringer to shatter Frostmourne, releasing all the souls that it had trapped inside. Souls from Arthas' betrayal of Lordaeron and the Paladins of the Silver Hand, souls from his Scourge campaign through Silvermoon, from his siege of Dalaran, from his defense of the Frozen Throne, and from his world-threatening operations in Northrend. All these souls were freed and sought vengeance against the one who had not only slain them, but denied them a peaceful afterlife. The soul swirled around the Lich King, lifting him into the air before he collapsed to the ground, his helmet falling from his head. One spirit in particular approached Arthas, the spirit of his father, King Tyrannus Menethil II. Arthas asked his father's spirit if it was over, and it was. No king rules forever. Aftermath of the raid of Icecrown Citadel. Bolvar Fordragon's body was never found after the events of the Wrathgate. As it turned out, the Scourge had recovered him, scorched by the Red Dragon's flames, yet still living. He was brought to the Lich King, where he was bound and tortured. King Tyrannus' spirit revealed that someone would have to take the Lich King's role in order to keep the Scourge in check. Tyrion Fordring prepared himself to take on the burden. However, Bolvar volunteered for the duty. He instructed Tyrion to tell the world that the Lich King was dead and that Bolvar Fordragon had died with him. Following the Lich King's demise, Sylvanas concluded that she no longer had a reason to remain in this world, so she threw herself off of Icecrown Citadel in an attempt to commit suicide. What she learned about her and the Forsaken's potential afterlife was not pleasant, and she quickly regretted her decision. Fortunately for her, a group of 9 Valkyr interceded and made a pact with the Dark Lady. Since the Lich King was dead, and his replacement Bolvar only wished to keep the Scourge pacified, the Valkyr risked being imprisoned at Icecrown Citadel, potentially forever. To avoid this, the Valkyr agreed to align themselves with Sylvanas, freeing them from their allegiance to the Lich King and granting Sylvanas another chance to walk the mortal world. One Valkyr, and Hilda the Caller, took Sylvanas' place in death, while the remaining 8 were bound to the Dark Lady. Together, the 9 shared freedom, life, and power over the dead. Notes and Trivia. Shadowlands retcons. Apparently, Zoval the Jailer was behind the creation of Frostmourne and the Lich King's helmet, the Helm of Domination. Furthermore, he was issuing instructions to the Dreadlords to serve his goal. His goal was to influence Ner'zhul and then the subsequent Lich Kings to allow him access to Azeroth from the Shadowlands. He wished to use the World Soul as a power source that could reconstruct reality. Outro. This story is a long one, so I'll try to keep this brief. The sources for this video were the books Arthas, Rise of the Lich King by Christy Golden, World of Warcraft Chronicle Volume 3 by Chris Metzen, Matt Burns, and Robert Brooks, the Ashbringer comics by Mickey Nielsen, and of course the games Warcraft 3 and World of Warcraft. Thank you for watching.